Hello interwebs! As many of you know, I had a lot of thoughts and concerns about how Star Trek Discovery has handled its much touted transgender and non-binary representation so far in its third season. In fact, I did a whole video sharing those concerns about everything I've seen at the time of the recording of this video, which is everything up until episode 4, Forget Me Not, in that show's third season, in a video that came out on Monday of this week, which I recommend you watch. But because I did a video where I spoke even a tad negatively about something, despite saying repeatedly in said video that I wasn't condemning the show for this, just expressing my nuanced critical concern as a member of the trans community, and because this is the internet, that basically means everything that I said amounted to
I hate Discovery, it's the absolute worst show. Alex Kurtzman has ruined Star Trek forever.
Which of course is totally what I believe. But in all seriousness, despite my concerns, I still love Discovery, even if there are things that I take issue with or am worried about. Because you see, things are not a zero-sum game. I can be critical of something while also finding a lot to love, and indeed love in that same thing. It's called, having a nuanced opinion. Who would have thought? On the internet? Crazy, I know. But my snarkiness aside, I actually did want to counterbalance my earlier video with this video's discussion on some of the truly thoughtful and beautiful things I saw in that same episode, Forget Me Not, when it came to transgender and the larger LGBTQ community representation. Because I think there were some truly wonderful things and wonderfully well written things in the episode. And I wanted to make sure I take the time to point them out because having listened to many reviews and discussions from many of my wonderful and amazing counterparts like Positively Trek's, Lori Loaded, Trek Central, and Ketwalski to name a very, very few, I still felt that some of the transgender readings and LGBTQ themes, which I think were intentional by the writers of this episode, may have been missed by a general audience because most of them aren't part of the LGBTQ community. So I figured it would be interesting and important to draw extra attention to them. And before we begin though, as I alluded to earlier, I wrote and filmed this video before episode 5 of this season came out, but this video will probably release after episode 5. So I recommend checking my full review on that episode if you want my thoughts. But if you do want to hear my thoughts on it without me having ever seen the episode, well then it's of course
I hate Discovery, it's the absolute worst show. Alex Kurtzman has ruined Star Trek forever.
But in all seriousness, let's do a brief close reading of the wonderful transgender and LGBTQ themes of Star Trek Discovery Season 3, Episode 4, Forget Me Not. While the whole episode is great, I mainly am going to be focusing on the Adira storyline, as that's the one with the most LGBTQ themes, though the stuff on the Discovery ship is also one of the most emotionally mature explorations of trauma that I've seen on a modern TV show. And as should be obvious, this is my personal interpretation of the episode. And while I do believe that some of these things were intended by the writers, interpretation is also a personal thing, and my thoughts, like my opinion overall on the episode, may not be your own, and that's totally cool. Again, nuance is fun. The first thing that I want to try and draw our attention to is this adorable little fishy bird. Isn't it so cute? I want one myself. Just imagine it like floating around your apartment. I think that would be it would be so much fun. But it's also a wonderful visual representation of the idea of transition and how fluidity of identity, something that many folks who push back against transgender people being able to transition because they see it as somehow unnatural, is actually an extremely natural and normal part of nature, even outside of real-life humans. And also, this fish is something that clearly wasn't written into the script, but something the visual effects people came up with, and it's brilliant.
This is the power of
the collaborative medium of film!
people!
Speaking of unnatural though, I did wish to mention the yellow M&M Trill guy calling Adira being a human host of a Trill symbiote an abomination.
She's an abomination. They must be separated immediately.
This is a bit on the nose and something I'm pretty sure many of you actually caught while you were watching the episode. But obviously, as has been interpreted by many transgender fans in previous incarnations of Star Trek, and as we will see later in this episode, the joining of a host and Trill symbiote has been seen as a metaphor for transgender people transitioning, with a joined Trill representing a post-transition transgender person. So, for the dude from Schitt's Creek to call Adira an abomination evokes how many trans people are often called that same thing. Abomination is a word that has a religious connotation to it, as the King James Version of the Bible uses the word abomination to describe homosexuality. The use of this word abomination then underscores how transgender people are often seen to be unnatural and against God's design because we change our bodies from their quote God-given forms. Again, as the trillbird fish thing showed, and as we see in nature in the real world, from things like intersex people and humans to oysters changing their genders at will, identities are often much more fluid and non-binary as people would be led to think. And also, we as humans have the ability to alter our bodies in ways that make us happier anyways, even outside of a trans context. Just having any type of surgery, from life-saving heart transplants to liposuction plastic surgery, isn't a moral thing. It's just something we can do to make ourselves happy for our own personal choice. But regardless, trans people and the LGBTQ community as a whole, and many minority groups, face hatred and bigotry simply for being seen as unnatural abominations just for who we are. Or in the case of trans people, the surgeries we pursue in order to live our lives without constant mental anguish. The next moment that I want to point to is several scenes later, once we get Adira's flashback to her boyfriend Gray's joining. This scene is where the trill metaphor for transgender people is made abundantly clear. Gray is about to undergo his joining, getting the trill symbiote put inside his body. As I mentioned before, many trans folks read the trill, and especially Dax on Deep Space Nine, as a transgender metaphor, with a joined trill representing a transgender person post-transition, and the actual act of joining with a trill as akin to getting a gender confirmation surgery. Something that I myself did, by the way, when I got my vaginoplasty, which, to keep things relatively PG-13, is what is known as the downstairs surgery on my genitals. Here in Gray's joining scene, that metaphor is made abundantly clear, with Gray being in a surgical gown and giving the face of pure joy that so many transgender people get when they're about to have that gender confirmation surgery that they hope to have for their entire lives. It's the same exact face that I made when I was getting that surgery, and the fact that Gray is played by a trans man makes that abundantly clear. Just like Gray the character probably fought and advocated for his ability to get a symbiote, so too do many trans folks have to go through many medical hoops, and sometimes a healthcare system that actively tries to delegitimize their need for surgery in order to get said gender confirmation surgery. However, in the scene, Adira asks Gray,
"When this is all over, after you and the symbiont have joined, will you still be you?"
Of course I'll still be me.
Many partners, as well as even friends and family of transgender folks who begin transitioning, often worry about if the person they love will be different after transitioning. Now, every single transgender person, because we are not a monolith, views their transition differently. Some trans people may wish to view their transition as a sort of symbolic death, and that's totally okay. That's how they wish to cope with it. Yet, many transgender folks, including myself, see their transition as not killing the person who they were before, but as a way to better reflect who they are on the inside, on their outside. As Grace says in the episode later on,
I'm still me. Just more me.
That's a line that I myself have said many times about my transition to many of my friends who thought I would be changing after my transition. My transition just made me more me. Gray, for example, is obviously much happier with his life post-joining. And many trans folks are way happier post-transition because they are now able to live a life that fits them better, that makes them more them, that shows others more of who they are on the outside, and sharing the gift of their inner soul more clearly than ever before. Yet, Adira is still reticent and doesn't feel completely comfortable with Gray post-transition. And this is where we get my favorite moment of the episode, because Gray says this,
"I feel like I need to keep up."
Being a crazy person, it's not a race.
You see, there's this false belief by many folks who haven't met trans people that trans people will demand that you instantly get and understand every single element of being a trans person, and that you're never allowed to express any discomfort at all at any point. That trans people will instantly attack you if you get something wrong. Now that's incorrect. Transitions are hard for everyone involved to understand and come to terms with, trans people included. That's why it's called a transition, not a switch or immediate change. When I came out, it took my friends months to get my pronouns correct, for example, or get comfortable with seeing me in a dress in public with them. I myself felt weird being in a dress in public, even though it's what I had wanted my entire life. It's not like I instantly flicked a switch and just felt comfortable being the gender that I'd always wanted to present as. It took time. It takes time. And as Grace says, it's not a race. We all get there as long as we're trying. The only thing trans people will get angry at you for is if you are not trying at all to understand or are actively being disrespectful. Trans people may make you uncomfortable at first. That's understandable. We're all uncomfortable with things we don't have experience with, trans people included. But it's about pushing through that mild discomfort you may feel in order to make others have a chance to live a life that feels worth living. Lean into and explore your discomfort. Don't push it away. And I love that Gray understands and expresses that with Adira. He validates her discomfort and validates that it's a real emotion that she is grappling with, and I adore that. The next thing that I want to draw attention to, though, is Adira's quilt, which she gifts to Gray and contains images of the story of their relationship. The quilt is perhaps the most beautiful metaphor in this whole episode and contains, no pun intended, layers of meaning. The first is obvious. The quilt is made up of different patches, just as Trill are made up of different hosts. However, life too is in different stages, like childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Trans people also go through many stages as well, like before, during, and post-transition. And this quilt evokes all of that. And as hard as it is to watch Gray die, it was also extremely evocative that he dies wrapped in that very same quilt. His death just another part of their love story. It also points to the theme of trauma that runs throughout this whole episode. How trauma is often wrapped up in our memory and how we process our memories of trauma, and is dealt with in different stages throughout our life, and isn't always resolved all at once or even ever completely. But that also ties to the stuff going on the Discovery ship that is slightly beyond this video's reading. But the quilt also references something more explicit, the AIDS Quilt Project, a project conceived by AIDS activist Cleve Jones after the assassination of gay politician Harvey Milk. Back in the 1980s, the LGBTQ community in the United States was being devastated by AIDS, with that community and many others receiving little help from the United States government and specifically presidents like Ronald Reagan because the virus was seen incorrectly and prejudicially as a gay virus because it disproportionately affected the LGBTQ community. As a result, many in the gay community were left to die horribly and often were largely forgotten and ignored, especially by families who had disowned them. It also left those in the LGBTQ community who had survived traumatized because of the near weekly funerals they had to attend and the loved ones and partners they watched pass away.
Every day you heard about somebody else who had died. Everybody was torn between grief and terror and absolute rage at the government because President Reagan did not mention a word for years.
Mr. Reagan said prevention is better than a cure.
Abstinence has been lacking in much of the education.
Within my own community, ballroom community, I started seeing how everybody was pushing away. Like, don't touch me, like they wouldn't eat from the same spoon, they wouldn't do anything, they don't want to breathe next to one another.
You didn't even know what to make of it. It was a creative holocaust on everyone that one knew.
Gary and Julio, who lived here with me, they both died of AIDS, and
the names just kept pouring and pouring. And I just was waiting for them to say my name.
So the AIDS quilt was a project where those who had lost someone they cared about could write their loved ones' names on a sign, and all the signs were made into a very large quilt. And it quickly became, and still is, the largest piece of community folk art in the world. A piece of art meant to share forgotten history, a history defined by trauma and made up of names of those who are now dead, but were still loved even after they passed away. So for Gray, a character played by a transgender man, to be wrapped up in a quilt covered in his blood as he dies, is evoking all of that trauma and pain with that quilt. And that idea comes around at the very end of the episode, when Adira is asked by the Trill to name her previous host, something that she hadn't been able to remember at the top of the episode. Adira now remembers the names of all those Trill hosts of Tal who had died before her, and they pass along their lives, their memories, their traumas, and yet the gift that they had all lived lives filled with love, just like all those who had died and had their names placed on the AIDS quilt had. And finally, I should mention, at the beginning of the episode, the Trill mentioned that they are honored to have a host return to their planet because much of their planet's history had been lost in the burn, something that we could parallel with the AIDS epidemic for the Trill. And so a Trill host could help the Trill save some of that history with their memories.
Our symbionts carry our history. The burn, the population was decimated. To have a symbiont return home is a blessing.
Adira's ability to remember and connect with her Trill symbiote helps the community of Trill carry on the history of their community, just when they had thought they had lost it forever. And this too, as is exemplified by the AIDS quilt, is just how the LGBTQ community tries to continue the sharing of our history through preservation of stories and community memories, because, at least in the United States, our history has historically been eradicated, ignored, or destroyed. And so, That is just some of the beautiful queer and transgender theming, symbolism, and metaphors that I found in Forget Me Not. As I said, I do have concerns with how some of the trans representation has gone on Star Trek Discovery, but that does not mean I don't think that it has also shown deep, thoughtful, and beautiful care at trying to represent the struggles, ideas, and themes that the United States LGBTQ community has dealt with for many decades now. And it should be pointed out, and it should be clear, the things that I think are beautiful about this episode are also the things that I worry about. As beautiful as I find a lot of these moments are, they're also hard to watch because they are so wrapped up in very real and very recent trauma for the LGBTQ community. Star Trek has always been a show about showing us a future past that trauma, but I also appreciate that it took the time to show that trauma when other shows and other places have wholesale ignored it for so long. So I'm saddened that my community's representation in the show is still defined by that very real trauma, but I'm also glad that it's acknowledged and validated. And I'm also glad that the show took time to understand the trans experience as well, even if it's only told through alien metaphor, and it's the first thing that we know about these trans characters, even if it is again told through alien metaphor. As I said at the top of this video, things are rarely all good or all bad. Discovery has made mistakes, but it also has a ton of beauty inside of it as well. As Gray said in the episode, it's not a race. We're all learning together. And I think to dismiss Discovery whole cloth for some of its mistakes does a disservice to some of its more beautiful moments as well. We shouldn't ignore those mistakes or problems, we should look directly at them. But we're all in this together, and it's important that we do grow together with patience, understanding, and remembering where we came from, in order to keep pushing forward to those new frontiers of representation in our favorite franchise. And I want to commend the writers of Star Trek Discovery for their successes, even when they've had failures at the same time.
All the hosts, their memories are still coming to me.
I expect it'll take a while.
So, quick little postscript on this video. The morning of the day that I filmed this video, so just a few hours ago, my grandfather passed away. And I don't share that in order to garner sympathy with any of you out in the audience, but because of the way the world is at the moment, I am unable to be with my family or be as close to them as I would want to. And I feel a little bit frustrated and stuck in that at the moment. And so I felt to not acknowledge it in some way felt wrong, and felt like I just wanted to say something about his death. And I'm sure I will probably find a clearer way to talk about his death once I have processed it more. But I just wish to dedicate this moment in this video to just acknowledging his life, and remembering his life, and remembering his part in the story of my life, just like the quilt in the episode, and how that stage of my life is now over, as is his life. So yeah, I haven't fully processed it, and so I'm going to kind of end talking about it here. And maybe I'll do something about it later on, maybe I won't. Just depends on how I wish to process his death, but I just wanted to acknowledge it in some way with this medium that I have at my disposal. So yes, here is to my grandfather, and thank you all for indulging me this one moment, and thank you for watching this video. Thank you so much to all of my patrons, especially Catherine Lambeth, Ashley Allen Bokikio, Miranda Janelle, Eli Berg-Moss, Ashlyn Solstice, Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Randy Thompson, Chamomile Tea, Philip Sorbello, Munir Amlani, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Stephen Schuthart, Wellington Marcus, Wayne Twitchell, Buttoneer, Ish the Mad, Dominic Noble, John Steele, Gavin Robinson, Michael Beam, William Stewart, Nathan Olson, Amanda Ronnie Indange, The Sir Spence, BBD, Hannah F., Miguel Posadas, Jason Knott, Maeve, Andrew Jorgenston, Sabraxis, Jasmine, Chris Brown, Bree Beecher, Nathan Steele, Chloe Dollar, Jane Packard, Dante St. James, Wendizzle Bizzle, Geek Filter, Mark the Edge, Pissed and Twisted Garage, Gretchen Badger, Sarah Bystam, Celestial Dawn, Polly Mina, Din, Jean Mithoon, Lysa, Andrew Lamoureux, Zone 1 Librarian, Michael Hardy. Thank you, all of you, especially this month.